Thanks very much, Mark. Today, as you said, we're going to talk about some of the biggest challenges facing today's worker, the big three. And these range from the novel and disruptive to the familiar. So as we address extreme weather, workplace safety, and mental health, what may surprise you are connections across this broad range of topics and with recurring themes that you've heard throughout AIS. With weather data indicating increasingly extreme temperatures and changes in global weather patterns, workers face this challenge on the job. So in the first half of our discussion, we'll leverage statistical models to explain the effects of heat, cold, and precipitation on workers' compensation claims and potential future outcomes for the most impacted industries.
Well, Patrick, so much for nothing new under the sun. And that goes for the workplace, too. In our discussion of workplace safety, we'll address the long-established causes for the most common injuries and point out game-changing opportunities for technology and safety advances to protect workers. Looking beyond physical risks and effects, we'll obtain a deeper understanding of these challenges through our research into psychological effects. Mental health is an incredibly complex topic, but it's become inseparable from the way we understand ourselves and each other. When a worker is injured on the job, their mental health is inextricably linked to their recovery journey. So we're going to explain how mental claims emerge in workers' compensation, equipping you to preemptively identify them, and completing our trifecta. That's your overview of the big three. Now, Patrick, let's get into our findings.
All right. So as promised, we're going to start by talking about the impact of extreme weather. And we'll highlight both what happens in hot as well as cold and wet conditions. This is an increasingly important topic for workers' compensation and insurance more broadly. 2023 was the warmest year on record, and recent years have been expensive winter storm seasons for insurance as well. So what we'll do is show findings about the relationship between weather conditions and workers' compensation claims using over 20 years of NCCI data. And then we'll briefly explore a couple scenarios to illustrate the potential overall impact of extreme weather across a period of time. The most basic and most important weather variable we'll consider is temperature. And here you can see a map of the United States over our study period from 2001 to 2022 by average high temperature over the course of the year. And you can see different regions of the US exposed to very different average temperatures. And because NCCI receives data for a wide range of states, we'll be able to examine impacts of heat and cold, as well as how these interact with precipitation. Now, the second map shows the average high temperature in 2023 compared to the average of the period we just showed. So where that first picture showed the variation in climate across the continental US, this one is showing in yellow and red that 2023 was a warmer year almost everywhere. And as we go along, we want to be thinking about what both maps are showing us. How much are different places affected by heat or other extreme weather? And how much could they be affected by potential increases in extreme weather? So before we get into the results, we'll briefly walk through the basics of our modeling strategy. First, what we're going to be doing is comparing the number of claims on different types of days to a mild weather baseline, which we set at 60 to 65 degrees. We're also going to control for things like month, year, state, city, and exposure base, because we want to separate the impact of temperature from other factors like mix of business, state laws and regulations, local economic conditions, or anything else that's varying over time and space. In some models, we'll also consider precipitation, which we're going to find makes a particular difference on snowy or icy days. We'll begin by showing results for all workers, but then we'll also talk about worker experience by economic sector and for different causes of injury. And importantly, all of our analysis here is going to focus on all claims. So this includes potential increases in injuries from things that may be more directly linked to weather, like heat exhaustion or slip and falls on ice and snow, but it goes beyond such injuries. Workers may suffer more injuries when working under difficult conditions of all types, and it's that total effect that we're interested in measuring. So now we'll start with some results, starting with the impact of temperature on work injuries. And the first thing to see here in orange is that all else equal, injuries increase with heat. we start to see small impacts, even a few degrees above our baseline. By the time we get into the low 80s, we see about 5% more injuries than that low 60s comparison point, and a little bit over 10% for high temperatures above 100. For cold days, you don't see that same monotone relationship. Rather, here we see work injuries peak about 5% above baseline on days when the high temperature is right around freezing. Next, we interact temperature with precipitation. And for dry days, which you see right now, the chart looks very similar to the last one, just with somewhat smaller impact for cold days. But cold and wet days are different. So precipitation on hot days, we see the rain attenuating the effect of heat a little bit. But on these freezing days, these wet days are much more hazardous. Now that 30 to 35 degree range has about 10% more injuries than a mild and dry day, which is about the same size as the impact of the hottest days in our sample. And as we'll discuss more later, that particular effect is largely driven by more slips and falls.
So Patrick's mapped out the impact of temperature and precipitation for all workers. Now we'll expand those insights, comparing and contrasting temperature effects at the industry level, starting with construction. Construction doesn't follow the all-worker trend. There are fewer injuries on colder days, but the heat impacts are nearly twice as large as seen for all workers, as construction is, of course, a physically demanding sector, taking place largely outdoors and subject to seasonal fluctuations. Next, let's look at transportation and warehousing. Here, the heat impacts are comparable to those for all workers, close to 5% increases on 80-degree days and 10% on 100-degree days. But the effects of cold days are far more pronounced. Exposure to harsh, wintry conditions can heighten environmental hazards like driving in icy conditions or potential slips and falls while loading, unloading, and making deliveries. Even office workers working indoors in largely climate-controlled environments aren't immune to weather effects. The heat impacts are smaller than overall, but still non-zero. And office workers see the same uptick around freezing temperatures as for all workers. On that note, let's freeze this chart action and defrost with a recap. Thank you. The variation of temperature impacts across industry sectors are largely attributable to the nature of the work and exposure to the outdoors. Now, using similar analysis, we also find varied patterns by cause of injury. Contact and strain injuries both peak on the hottest days and are slightly lower on cold days compared to mild ones. However, strains exhibit smaller absolute impacts overall, whether positive or negative, compared to other causes of injury. But what we're really going to focus on here is our slips and falls that primarily drive the positive relationship we observe between colder days and more work-related injuries.
Yeah, sorry, Anne, but to reinforce that point, I'm going to thaw off the charts and show a couple more pictures. In fact, actually, I want to start showing two at once. So we'll look at that on the next slide. So now we're looking at impacts on claims for two causes of injury, slip and falls and motor vehicle accidents. We're doing this by precipitation, and what you're seeing here is for dry days. So you see, even on dry days, cold days are associated with 30 to 40% more slip and fall injuries than mild days. But effects on motor vehicle accidents on dry days are pretty small. But now again, when we look at cold and wet days, now we see a big increase in motor vehicle accidents and even larger effects on slip and falls. And as we said, this is what drives that overall result we saw several slides ago. Cold and wet days are more hazardous, primarily because of this relative increase in slip and falls. So now we've showed several estimates talking about how much temperature and precipitation affect workplace injuries on particular types of days. But what does this mean overall? For example, how much are construction workers affected over the course of a whole summer? Or how many more slip and falls do we see due to wintry conditions over a whole winter in a cold weather city? And then, as we talked about with these maps, there's a second set of questions. How much extra impact do we see when we see more severe weather? And we saw different regions facing very different average temperatures, but most regions warmer in 2023 than usual. So we'll talk through these two example scenarios that I've just mentioned, the impact of summer heat on construction and the impact of winter weather on slip and falls. So we'll start with construction. And now here, what you're seeing in these bars are the estimated impact of the average weather in each season on construction injuries compared to that low 60s baseline. And remember, Anne showed you a little bit ago, the impact of construction injuries was about twice as large as for overall workers, maybe like 10% in the 80s and close to 20% on the hottest days. So this increase of over 10% you see in the summer is showing that summer days tend to be hot and on the right side of the chart. So we'll next focus on that summer result for different places. So here we split the cities in our data into 4 groups from coldest to warmest average high temperatures and show the impact of summer heat on each. Of course, there's more heat in places like Miami or Phoenix than in Chicago or Denver, so this estimated impact is larger, about twice as large, and the hottest is the coolest cities. But then we want to do that one extra step. 2023 and some other years were warmer than average. What happens if each city experiences an especially hot summer, not an average one? And we show these additional effects in dark orange. And the takeaway here is that different cities or different regions may experience different levels of extreme heat, but that additional impact from more heat is about the same everywhere. And that makes sense if you think back to our initial finding, where we saw kind of a straight line increase in our estimates. The difference from going from 70 to 75 is about the same as 80 to 85 or 90 to 95. So more hot days in any city by that city's own standards may affect workers' compensation injuries in about the same way. Now, we'll do one more, repeating the same exercise, but now focused on the impact of precipitation on slip and falls. So this time, we're going to hold temperature constant, but vary the number of rainy or icy days. So this one is now showing the estimated impact of precipitation by season on injuries compared to a baseline with no wet days at all. And of course, we have already showed you the biggest impacts are on days at or below freezing, so of course the biggest impacts are in the winter. In the model, we find about 5% more injuries from an average amount of winter precipitation versus an equally cold but completely dry winter, and smaller impacts in the warmer seasons. And just as we did for construction in summer, we take that 5% and look at it for the different city types. And of course, the coldest cities have the biggest effects. In the warmer cities, like the one we're all gathered in today, winters are pretty mild, and the impact of rainy days we saw is small or even negative at higher temperatures. But this leads to a slightly different implication for increased winter weather as for summer heat. When we estimate that extra impact from an especially wet winter, we see the additional effects are also larger for the cold and cool cities. And again, this is due to the impact being concentrated on these freezing days, which of course mostly occur in colder regions. So we'll recap the insights from our first section. What we saw is across NCCI states, both hot and cold days have more workers' compensation injuries than mild days. And these are meaningful effects overall, but particularly impactful for certain types of injuries and certain types of jobs. And any increased extreme weather, we'd expect the cold and wet impacts to be mostly concentrated in colder areas, but increased heat could have similar marginal effects in all regions. And this is just some of what we have looked at. We will be releasing a research report on ncci.com later this year, which has more detail on the findings we've shared today, as well as some additional findings. But as we move to the second of our big three, we see extreme weather creates conditions for more claims across industries, but that's not inevitable. Offsetting variables, employment trends, and safety practices and other things also factor into overall frequency declines.
Right, but we also saw the weather effect on claims isn't uniform across sectors. And that points to the need for sector-specific safety solutions and a deeper look at frequency at the industry level. At the same time, widespread injuries across industries could benefit from innovative safety tech. You heard from yesterday's panel on safety technologies and their potential to enhance workplace safety. Advanced wearables, computer vision, AI applications, actively being developed and deployed, but they're not yet as widely adopted to emerging carrier data for us to evaluate impacts on loss costs. But our comprehensive data can guide the focus of safety technologies to maximize injury prevention. We'll identify the top causes of injury, making the workplace less safe, and the subsequent challenges for today's worker. When we investigated weather impacts, we saw more slips and falls on wet and icy days, whereas injuries like strains are less sensitive to weather conditions. To put that into context, across industries, over 60% of lost time claims are attributable to strains, slips, and falls. What's notable is that all sectors exhibit significant shares of both. While technology providers and employers are citing an initial focus on reducing injuries like strains in sectors like manufacturing, warehousing, and logistics, there may well be implications for other industries. NCCI data indicates nearly 2/3 of all strains are from lifting, pushing and pulling, and twisting. While the resulting medical conditions can impact any practically part of the body, the lower back is particularly vulnerable. Lifting alone accounts for half of all low back pain injuries in workers' compensation. Now, when you add strains, slips, and falls together, that addresses 80% of the underlying causes for low back pain claims. Our research into large claims shows a propensity for their costs and treatments to escalate over time. The challenges to physical recovery can also put strains on mental health. But in yesterday's State of the Line, Donna pointed out declining frequency of these injuries and the subsequent impacts on overall frequency trends. Safety technologies have a role to play in these trends. As they evolve, their transformative potential could mitigate more risk, causes, and injuries if they work as intended and be a game changer for workers everywhere. So our findings here are encouraging. The data indicate a high degree of consistency in hazardous movements across industries. And while the initial emphasis has been on manufacturing and warehousing, there's potential for broader injury reduction that focuses on mitigating hazardous body movements and could apply to any jobs involving such maneuvers. As safety technology becomes more widely adopted, NCCI is actively monitoring this topic and providing you with insights. This discussion only scratches the surface. NCCI.com is a great resource for more insights like the series Damien mentioned on the future of workplace safety technology, where we highlight carrier perspectives on the latest trends. But in the reality of right here and now, workers are still injured every day. The experience can be traumatic and stressful, triggering existing mental conditions or inducing new ones. In our third segment, we'll share research into the nature, prevalence, and emergence of these mental claims. Work comp recognizes 3 types of psychological injuries based on whether a physical injury is present. When a physical injury is accompanied by a mental injury like anxiety or substance use disorder, the claim is called a physical mental claim, or PM. Mental physical claims, on the other hand, are mental-only injuries that later result in a physical injury. For example, anxiety that leads to a heart attack. And thirdly, we have mental claims, which are mental-only injuries such as PTSD. Now, in the past 6 years, 20 states, the ones highlighted in purple, enacted statutory language regarding compensability of these claims to varying degrees. This is in addition to the 16 states in the lighter shades with existing compensability coverage. This legislative trend reflects broader concerns about mental health beyond the workplace. Adding that to the fact that May is recognized as Mental Health Awareness Month, this discussion couldn't be more essential or timely. In 2021, the National Institute of Mental Health estimated 1 in 5 adults in the US lives with a diagnosable mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that ranges in impairment from none to severe. Research also suggests that injured workers are subject to psychosocial risk factors like stress and anxiety symptoms that can impact recovery outcomes. These findings are important context and motivation for our research. Our analysis is based on an objective definition of mental claims as treated or diagnosed per DSM criteria. Consequently, these serve as conservative estimates for the prevalence of mental injuries affecting injured workers, focusing on a critical subset of work comp claims. But our first key finding is that even with considerable legislative attention, mental claims constitute a very small share of lost time claims reported to NCCI. We see fewer than 250 in a given year, little or no indication of trend, and even fewer mental physical claims. In contrast, we observe over 100 times that many lost time physical mental claims in a given year. These physical mental claims make up a far more substantial share of claims and losses, so that's where we're going to focus for insights. We'll begin our path to enlightenment with Patrick, identifying different types of physical mental claims and discussing trends.
Okay, so thank you. Our research, we identified 3 types of physical mental claims with differing characteristics, and we do this mostly by diagnosis. So the first group are those diagnosed with a mental disorder. The second group are claims diagnosed with behavioral disorders, and there are a few claims, about 9% of the first group are diagnosed with a mental disorder and also a behavioral disorder like nicotine or opioid use. But the trajectories of these claims are predominantly characterized by the mental diagnosis, so we put it in the first group. A third, smaller category of claims, we don't observe a diagnosis for mental or substance use disorder, but we do see some psychological evaluations or treatments, such as psychotherapy sessions. So all 3 of these exhibit distinct patterns, and we'll talk more about those beginning with diagnoses. So as for what's in each, the first group, the largest part is anxiety, which includes stress disorders, followed by mood or depression. So one or both of these conditions is identified on 77% of physical mental claims with a mental diagnosis. The second group is mostly diagnoses for nicotine use, which includes vaping. And you'll see just 4% are associated with opioid usage. Overall, the prevalence of these claims has been relatively stable over the period we've looked at. Physical mental claims comprised about 8.5% to 10% of all lost time claims over the last 12 years. And you see 8.7 at the first year we see and 8.8 in the last. There's a modest peak around 2017. But we can get more insight from then breaking down these 3 categories and looking at each individually. So the key insight here in this section is that any slight trends you saw on the last slide are mostly driven by changes in the behavioral diagnoses in blue. We see the same slight peak in 2017 and a slight decline since then, particularly the nicotine and opioid related. We are in recent years seeing an increase in vape-related diagnoses for this group, which is something to keep an eye on. The projected share of diagnosed mental claims appears stable at around 4%. It is important for us to acknowledge a margin of uncertainty in these latest projections, since about a quarter of mental diagnoses emerge beyond the first year following the accident. And that third group, treated but not diagnosed, shows stable shares over the last 12 years, accounting for less than 1% of lost time claims in each year. When we move from looking at shares of claims to the share of projected incurred losses, we see something very different. What stands out here most are the diagnosed mental claims in yellow, which were around, remember, 4% of claims, but in the neighborhood of 20% of losses. This warrants a deeper look at severity, and for that, we'll turn back to Anne, who will take us through this and the remainder of our discussion on claims and mental health.
Thanks, Patrick. To put severity into perspective, the average purely physical lost time claim has a projected severity of around $40,000. The average substance claim has a severity of nearly twice that, around $80,000. Treated mental claims, while still a small share, have more than 3.5 times the average severity. But the key finding here is the differential for the diagnosed mental claims, which are on average more than 6 times that of the average purely physical claim. This is largely driven by an association with large claims and more severe physical conditions. Approximately half of claims at Fifth Report with incurred losses greater than $500,000 indicate at least one mental diagnosis over the treatment. This suggests differences in the underlying claim mix, that some work comp injuries have a higher propensity for anxiety or depression, but it doesn't explain why. To understand the path to a mental diagnosis and the aftermath, then, let's look at an injured worker's recovery journey. Consider a 57-year-old man who, as a result of a slip and fall, suffered a traumatic head injury. After 3 months of intensive inpatient treatment, he was released and began physical therapy sessions with evaluations. After 6 months of this routine, he was diagnosed with severe anxiety and had 2 psychotherapy sessions. The treatment regimen also shifted at this point to include electrostimulation, prescription drugs, and continued physical therapy for the next 3 years. Each stage of this worker's journey exhibits patterns that are consistent with deeper observations on diagnosed mental claims. There are, in fact, 5 key observations we'll highlight, beginning with initial treatment. Claims with a mental diagnosis often incur a significant portion, over 40% of costs from inpatient stays in that first year of treatment. Now, does that prompt a drum roll in anyone's mind? Well, it should. These extensive inpatient stays make the utilization trends that Raji and John talked about yesterday incredibly relevant for understanding mental claim trajectories. They're also a key source of differentiation from purely physical claims that have larger shares related to outpatient costs. These extended inpatient stays often precede extensive physical therapy that can last for months or even years. And that's our second key finding and a key driver of higher rates of physician utilization that exceeds that of purely physical claims by 60%. The anxiety diagnosis 9 months post-injury is consistent with the finding that Patrick alluded to earlier, namely that 73% of lost time claims with a mental diagnosis are diagnosed within 1 year of the accident. The cost of psychological treatments like psychotherapy are often a small share of costs for these types of claims. In this case, the combined indemnity and medical incurred exceeded $1 million, while the costs for psychovalent therapy were around $500 in total. As treatment continues, prescription drugs are included, which is extremely common among claims with longer durations. What distinguishes diagnosed mental claims at later stages of treatment are costs for home help and durable medical equipment, and these are nearly double the shares for an actively treated purely physical claim, forming yet another chapter in the story of higher severity and duration. This brings us to the last and our most important observation, because it ties all of this together, and that's medical condition, which is one of the strongest data fields for studying mental diagnosis. Recall, in this case, the worker suffered a traumatic head injury. Nearly a third of all workers with TBIs are diagnosed with a mental disorder over the course of treatment. And that's second to cases of chronic pain, where the rate of mental diagnosis is roughly 8 times higher than average. Our research identified medical condition to be one of the most robust indicators for characterizing mental claims, outweighing factors such as age, gender, or state. But this is really intuitive. TBIs, chronic pain, and related physical conditions are in many ways inseparable from mental diagnoses. This implies major differences in the underlying claim mix for diagnosed mental compared to purely physical claims. To quantify that, if we account for the mix of medical conditions, we find injured workers with a mental diagnosis incur costs 3.7 times higher than their pure physical counterparts. If you also account for surgery mix, mental diagnosed claims are still 2.5 times as costly, reaffirming that claims with a mental diagnosis are overall more severe. Now, this brings us to the end of the presentation. but not the research. As NCCI continues to monitor legislative trends, mental health, what can you, as work comp stakeholders, do to address these challenges? Our analysis provides you with insights to preemptively identify concerning behavioral trends from vaping in injured workers that are more likely to experience stress and anxiety, depression throughout their treatments, especially when it comes to large claims or medical conditions like TBIs or chronic pain. In practice, proactive identification is a powerful tool to support workers at higher risk for mental conditions throughout treatment. If there's one thing you take away from this discussion, it's a proactive attitude to rise to the challenges facing today's worker, because these challenges aren't going to solve themselves. Safety advances are poised to prevent physical injuries, but worker buy-in, cost, efficacy, other hurdles remain. NCCI is actively engaging in learning from the innovators and identifying new frontiers for these technologies. But a proactive attitude is much more effective when combined with knowledge. As Patrick brings us to a close, I'll just reiterate that as work comp stakeholders, your industry expertise is crucial for implementing these technologies safely and effectively.
And that kind of focused understanding is also critical to our analysis of extreme weather, as we talked about insights by cause of injury or by sectors. And Amanda and Sandra are waiting in the wings to give you a lot more sector-specific insights in just a moment. We also highlighted a range of impacts across locations. You've been hearing from us that every state has a story. Well, so too does every city, every zip code, and ultimately every injured worker. So we hope that this look at the big three has provided you with some useful insights on some of the biggest challenges facing workers. We'll continue to look for ways to use this and updated data as we have it to continue to provide you with tools, resources, and insights to rise to these challenges. Thank you.